I think so.
Folks, thanks for coming to today's Brownbag. As always, I just want to make a few short announcements before I introduce today's speaker. We have later the week on Thursday, Marta Greenberg is going to be doing a book talk at the over at the Union. If you know where the not the main bookstore is, but the one just Jayhawk Inc. She'll be speaking in there at 4 o'clock on her new colloquial slogan textbook. So should be really interesting. Aside from that, I just sent out yesterday a notice from the history department that they have a number of different candidates for their modern Russian history position. And so I sent those out, but I also set off the sort of the speaking schedule, and they invite our graduate students as well, and our faculty, of course, to come and meet and talk with the students and attend their lectures. Our speaker today is Dr. Kipp, who recently retired from a federal service, but serves as an adjunct professor here at KU, as well as a weekly columnist on Eurasian security for the Jamestown Foundation, and I'm sure attends at least as many conferences and other speaking engagements as he did when he was not retired. But he served for a long time at Fort Leavenworth at the both at the Fort Military Studies Office as well as the School of Advanced Military Studies, where he served as deputy director. Today he's going to talk about U.S. and Russian negotiations.
Okay. All right. This is a topic which I have been working on roughly for the last 3 years, since I retired. And it was one which basically till last May I was reasonably optimistic on. We had gotten through the START 3 agreement. We were talking with the Russians on missile defense, and we were attempting to get started on bilateral or multilateral, it wasn't quite clear, negotiations on non-strategic nuclear weapons. The title, Woland, is taken from some remarks made by Sergei Karaganov. Sergei Karaganov is the director of the Council on Defense and Security in Russia. It's a private think tank founded by Yevgeny Primakov, and it is an unofficial voice on defense and security policy. And in analyzing the prospects for global zero, Karaganov basically made a case saying not much chance, or not much chance in the short term. And the reason he said it is at the heart of my talk today. He effectively said that the evil of strategic nuclear arms, the physical capacity of the United States and Russia to engage in such horrendous exchange that they would effectively annihilate themselves and each other, and possibly a good part of the rest of the world, was so frightening, fairly decent word for it, that it acted and has acted as an inhibitor upon conflict between the bilateral world of Russia and the United States, Soviet Union, United States, and since the Cold War was over, has continued to act as a check even in the face of an expanding nuclear club. Now, at the same time, Karaganov used an interesting expression. He said, you could call strategic nuclear weapons that force which wills evil and does good. And it's directly taken out of Faustus. And if you know your Bulgakov, it's an epigram at the beginning of Master and Margarita. The second part of Karaganov's discussion concerned tactical nuclear weapons. And I'll make an aside on strategic nuclear weapons, which is relevant to this topic. He said, and by the way, yes?
Just a question. There are some in your audience who don't know what Global Zero is.
Global Zero is literally the elimination of all nuclear weapons.
Thank you.
That is the attempt. Not only the strategic systems, but everybody, everywhere, and every capacity to make nuclear weapons. It is associated with the anti-proliferation maneuvers, and it was effectively a responsibility which President Obama took on at the time of his address in Prague in 2009, announcing the attempt to negotiate another strategic arms agreement, nuclear agreement with with Russia. And the notion was we would then continue beyond that. That's Global Zero. I was going to get to that after I got through Woland and our friend the Little Demons. Regarding Woland, an interesting comment that Karaganov made about Russian strategic nuclear systems, Soviet and Russian strategic nuclear systems, is that they had, in fact, a secondary impact of reducing the capability of the West, read the United States, of placing pressure upon the People's Republic of China. And that it was effectively a strategic good which Russia had trafficked in its relationship between the People's Republic and Russia. Now, those of you who know anything about the Chinese nuclear arsenal will know it's subject to some debate, but it is relatively small. Only about 100 ICBMs. Not particularly modernized. Much larger arsenal of non-strategic nuclear weapons in various modes, aircraft, ground missiles, naval systems, but not intercontinental ballistic missiles. At the same time, Karaganov talked about China gaining this benefit of having the Russian strategic arsenal play as a check upon Western pressure upon China. He also said that Russia maintained its own tactical nuclear weapons as a check upon any untoward Chinese ambitions. Which is to say, he not only talked about the use of nuclear weapons as deterrence, that is, preventing the exchange of strategic systems, he also talked about a warfighting utility of tactical nuclear weapons in some capacity to de-escalate a conflict between China and Russia. Now, this notion of de-escalation has been in Russian strategic thinking at least back to the late 1990s. It came into greater prominence when we unilaterally abolished the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2001, the Bush administration. And it effectively puts non-strategic nuclear weapons into a category of possible use. Now, if you're familiar with the arsenals that existed in Europe that were part of tactical nuclear weapons when we had the militarized Cold War, we had everything from small systems to theater strategic weapons. In ending the Cold War, we abolished a whole class of non-strategic nuclear weapons. That is, intermediary range ballistic missiles, the systems that could deliver relatively large nuclear devices in theater warfare. We gave up our Pershings and ground-launched cruise missiles, and they gave up their SS-20s and some systems of shorter range than that. Everyone who looks at the end of the Cold War sees that as the first step to the demilitarization of the conflict in Europe, as the bridge which essentially allowed for the military side of de-escalation of the Cold War and contributed effectively to the peaceful termination of that, what had been a militarized conflict in Europe. Karaganov's position to defend it made a certain sense if you were looking at the military balance in the Russian Far East. Because the military balance in the Russian Far East was a very small Russian conventional capability. There's about 3 brigades out in the Ussuri territory. There's a single brigade covers the territory across from Blagoveshchensk to Chita, and then there are 2 brigades deployed on the Chita-Irkutsk axis into Siberia. It's a very small force. Against it is 7 separate field armies of the Chinese. That is, there are brigades in the Russian case, and there are field armies made up of multiple divisions on the Chinese side. So the conventional balance between Russia and China in the Far East is overwhelmingly in favor of China. And the Russian answer to that has said, if it should become general aggression, is to in fact talk about selective nuclear usage against an opponent who the Russians categorized until only a few years ago as essentially a mass industrial army that would be slow to mobilize, slow to deploy, and could be relatively easily disrupted by deployment of the use of certain limited nuclear weapons in theater. There is always a fundamental question of that. Does that lead to the end of escalation, or do the Chinese escalate back? I can tell you that in the Cold War days, one of the themes which the Russian General Staff perpetually discussed was, what is the optimal number of nuclear weapons in a general offensive across Europe should NATO attack us? That is, the Soviet counteroffensive. And the answer, which the people who did the operations research, who did the modeling of this sort of thing, the Soviet General Staff coming back to, was 0. Because once one was used, you could never effectively predict and map the complex interchange of the 2 sides. There was no way you could guarantee that you would have escalation control and domination. And therefore, nuclear weapons, by the end of the Cold War in Europe, were looked upon something that was thoroughly linked with the tactical intermediate nuclear arsenals. So what you were deathly afraid of is that if anything went from conventional, go nuclear, it would go to strategic exchange, which inhibits both sides. Now, where are we? Well, this conversation we're going to have today is dedicated to 2 men. Both of them are spies. George Colt was a U.S. Air Force officer. He served as an assistant attaché and air attaché in Moscow. He ended up his career as a national intelligence officer for the CIA for Russia, from the end of the Cold War down to 2003. He became sick with cancer and died. It was George Colt who, in fact, began a security dialogue with the Russians, which I've been taking part in for the last, let's see, the first conversation actually took place in January 1991, when the Soviet Union still existed. It went on to conversations in Stockholm, London, Washington, and it's been ongoing since then. The fellow on the Russian side who was most responsible for continuing the conversations was Vitaly Schlageoff. He's also a spy. Schlageoff is a real spy. He was in what the Russians call agentura. Agentura is essentially spying in another country. His most important career was in South Africa, where he spied on the various programs that the South Africans had for nuclear and other weapons development, and got caught coming home in Switzerland, and spent several years in jail there, although they never identified exactly who he was. They knew he was a Russian agent, but never actually identified him or his work in South Africa. That only became public afterwards. When the Cold War was ending, he was, in fact, in the General Staff in charge of assessments of capitalist economies. Ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. And was the fellow who went up to Marshal Akrameyev when they were discussing what they would have to do for the final build of the final 5-year plan before perestroika. And the Soviet Union had, throughout the Cold War, had estimated what it would build, what it would maintain, on what the United States would do. And it was Schlageoff who came up with the estimate, which shocked most of the Soviet General Staff. In 1976, the Soviets estimated that the United States, in case of a general war, would produce 75,000 tanks in the first year of war. Now that's a model based on World War II mass mobilization, and it's every automobile factory, every capacity, every car works, every engine works devoted to that. Schlageoff, doing a hard analysis of our industrial plant, walked into Akrameyev in the mid-1980s and said, if there was a general war, the United States would produce 2,500 tanks in the first year of a war. Now there's a big difference between 75,000 and 2,500. What Schlageoff was effectively saying is the United States has gone from quantity to quality. The American military is informationizing its weapons. It is doing other things that are responsible for making it more effective as a military force. And our estimates of industrial war are, in fact, not based on how a conflict would be held. In short, he was anticipating what the United States would demonstrate in the Gulf War in 1990, 1991. That is a major influence on ending the Cold War, because it took out of the picture the notion of a conventional phase fought with largely industrial forces where numbers would be decisive in terms of the Soviet Union's advantage. We have negotiated in 1990, 1991 a deal for conventional forces in Europe. And if you look at that treaty and the balances that are supposed to be maintained in it, you will discover that it's all equipment that is now obsolete. It is all things that don't decide battles anymore, because they're military systems for industrial war. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery tubes, helicopters. None of them are you looking at the information component that optimizes and maximizes their capability. And what was happening with conventional war was that fundamental change. So what we have are two men who are effectively in positions to talk about where their respective military institutions were going, and interested in a dialogue about what, in fact, they would interact. I've been involved in this process. These are the places we meet, we go. I'm going to be involved with it in May of this year, preceding the summit, the NATO summit in Chicago. The context of our remarks are global zero and where we now stand. For most of the Cold War period, we relied on a militarized relationship with the Soviet Union. The end of the Cold War, that militarized aspect disappeared. And the attempt by both powers has been to keep militarization from becoming a predominant element in their bilateral relations. The problem is the fundamental asymmetry in the position of the two powers. The end of the Cold War found the United States with a military system that was engaged in a rapid transformation to what we'll call information warfare. Advanced systems that allowed for greater command and control, allowed for network-centric warfare, allowed for precision strike. And the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War had what was effectively a robust industrial military machine. And a nuclear component which was based largely on the technology of the 1950s and 60s and early 70s. That is not to say that it doesn't have its importance. As General Powell said when he was head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Russia, this time, is the only country in the world that can blow us off the face of the earth. And with that insight, Powell made bilateral U.S.-Russian relations a capital component in how we would approach our international engagement, beginning with the cooperation which was part of Bosnia, where a Russian brigade actually served inside an American division. But by the late 1990s, that had gone bad in Kosovo, and the Russians began to look at the United States as a country which had gained a capacity to engage in decisive, limited war. The first lesson they saw it in was the Gulf, which they saw as the signal of possible capacity. The second manifestation of it was in Kosovo, where the United States and its allies engaged in what was essentially no-contact warfare, an air campaign at the end. And a United States that was willing to talk about attempting to achieve strategic invulnerability. That's how the Russians read the decision by the Bush administration to abolish the ABM treaty. Now, given the utter weakness of Russian conventional forces, given the propensity of the United States to, in fact, engage in interventions, the Russians began to look at the problem of no-contact warfare as one that the Russian state would itself have to deal with. And at that point, what had made sense under Karaganov, that is, a check on the industrial power of China, which had no strategic escalatory capacity, to one where you were talking about having to use nuclear weapons to de-escalate some local war, where the initiative was in the hands of the intervening external power, almost always identified as the United States as the leader of a coalition of NATO or a coalition of willing, and immediate use of limited nuclear weapons. What kind of limited nuclear weapons? Well, very small yield, under 5 kilotons. Not particularly designed for blast effects. Designed rather, in fact, to attack command, control, and communication by electromagnetic pulse. If you set a detonation off at a particular altitude, depending on the size of the detonation, you can fry communications for anybody who uses digital systems. And it's very hard to harden them against EMP attack. Depending on what you want to do, if you're really crazy, you could take a 100 kiloton device, put it off of the middle part of the United States, and you could pretty well fry the East Coast. And everything would stop functioning. Every system, not just military and civilian. We, of course, have the same capability with them. But they were talking about it in the context of interventions in theaters where we were engaging in no-contact warfare, and they were going to counter it with the limited nuclear capability that they had before the collapse of their own conventional defense. The first time they exercised this was in June 1999. It was at the end of the war in Kosovo, and it was part and parcel of their statement that if you intervened in a manner similar to that in Kosovo against Russia, they would in fact escalate. The theater it was taken and took part in was a Baltic one, but the signal was not about the Baltic, the signal was about the Caucasus, where they, in 1999, were anticipating the outbreak of a war over Chechnya, and were effectively signaling, don't get involved here, because this is in fact a Russian sovereign problem. Since then, they have conducted what they call West exercises, West 2009, they did one in 2007, they did an East one in 2009, and then a Central one this year. They're all about how Russia defends itself, and they almost all invariably end in limited use of nuclear weapons. Now, the good news. When the Obama administration came in, there was already the public movement, major defense intellectuals across the globe, business types, academics, former statesman Henry Kissinger was involved, Secretary Brown, Secretary Perry, major figures on the Russian side as well, Europeans, saying, we have got to go to a strategy which will say we're going to get rid of nuclear weapons. The anti-proliferation, the non-proliferation, anti-proliferation arrangements that existed will not, in fact, be viable unless you have some clear evidence that the major nuclear powers are reducing their arsenals. And effectively what the Obama administration did was make that a high priority. That is the origin of START 3. And in START 3, the Russians and the United States negotiated their strategic arsenals down to the lowest level they've ever been, put in new safeguards in terms of verification, and looked like a solid agreement to manage that strategic part of the equation. At the same time, the Obama administration had also signaled that it was not going to go ahead with what had been the Bush plan for ballistic missile defense in Europe. What the Obama administration promised was a system based on theater nuclear defense capabilities already existing and their gradual adaptation. The problem was, as that adaptation became clearer and clearer, the Russians looked at it and said, unless you're willing to bring us into it, we will have to, in fact, break off relations in this area. And what the United States wanted to happen after the signing of the START Treaty was a set of negotiations about Russia's tactical nuclear arsenal. We wanted to have, as a first step, a conversation where both sides would lay out their existing tactical nuclear arsenals. The Russians, quite frankly, looking at it as a major factor in how they deal with China, said, we're not going to talk about that until we get into negotiations. And kept saying, we're not going there unless we get a deal on ballistic missile defense. We will accept as a beginning deal on that a legally binding statement from the United States that the European system, NATO system of ballistic missile defense will not be directed against Russia. We were saying it's not directed against Russia, it's directed against Iran as a rogue state, but we would not give them a legally binding statement. The consequence of that interaction was, quite frankly, by last November, the Russians said, okay, it's over. We have a certain set of moves we're going to make right now because we see the situation as it's developing. One which, quite frankly, is not going to ensure Russia's strategic protection. The consequence of that was Medvedev's announced moves. Some of them are purely symbolic. The activization of the advanced radar system in Kaliningrad doesn't effectively change much of anything. It just simply says the Russians are going to have their own ballistic missile defense system, and they will be looking west for their primary area and target. Improved aerospace protection, that means the S-500, which is their advanced anti-missile system, is going to be pushed forward, and they're going to deploy more of them. And it will be designed to protect the Russian missile-based system. Now, at the same time, the Russians are also massively moving their arsenal to sea. They are building more ballistic submarines. They are putting heavy missiles aboard those, which have multiple warheads, which will stay within the limits of SARC 3, but which will make it much, much more difficult to deal and intercept their general strategic arsenal. They are talking about applying cyber and other means to interfere with ballistic missile defense systems. Given the fact that we've crossed the line already on cyber attack, that states are not acknowledging it, but they are in fact engaging in cyber attacks, this is a very, very provocative area. Because when you get into this, it's very difficult to know who did what to whom. The Russians engaged in, whether it was the Russian state or individual Russians, engaged in attacks against Estonia. There were cyber attacks on both sides during the Georgian War, and there have been cyber attacks against Iranian facilities to take out specific technology and industrial processes. We're getting into an area where cyber is becoming part and parcel of not war, but pre-war. And don't have a really good idea what the limitation of the impacts are, because in the cyber world, the phenomenon of blowback, that is, you do something on an intended target, but it affects others, are quite unclear. So that's part and parcel of the response. It's one which, if you will, raises the likelihood of problems. They will deploy Iskander, which is a 300-mile missile in their south and west. It has both conventional and nuclear warheads. It also has the ability to maneuver in final phase, which makes it very difficult to shoot down. All of the advanced ICBMs the Russians have that capacity. That is, they have a hypersonic flight capability in their final re-entry phase, which makes ballistic missile defense effectively useless. You can't shoot them down because you can't get a lock on target. If the situation continues to develop, that's the last one. Out of all arms control and other disagreements. The one that is likely to be a specific response, and the Europeans are scared to death of it, is the end of INF. The Russians could do this very easily because they could point to Chinese theater modernization, non-strategic but intermediate range ballistic missiles, and say, we have to do that to counter that problem. But it would play back into the European theater and would in fact once again militarize at the nuclear level the situation in Europe. What's behind the new arms race? The fundamental point of departure here is Russia's own weakness. We look back and see the conflict of 2008 as a Russian victory over Georgia. In fact, the Russians came out of that war and said, my God, we cannot fight modern war. Russia lost 6 aircraft during that war. 3 of the ones that were shot down were by Russian systems. Now, if you're talking about modern warfare and command and control technology, that's a fundamental failure. Russians have no drones. The Georgians had drones, the Russians did not. The Russians have no capacity to manage battlefield information systems. They're doing something called the New Look right now. They're shifting brigade structures. They're doing all kinds of things. But they're also reliant upon developing a system that will allow their conventional forces to fight effectively on a modern battlefield. But they're not there yet. So in lieu of that capability, they are falling more and more back upon nuclear systems. And from 1999 on, Min Adam has been saying the answer for us is a new generation of nuclear weapons. Very small, designed for special effects, relatively easily delivered. And the question is how many and under what circumstances. As long as there is no agreement on tactical nuclear weapons and no transparency, we don't know where we are here. And that raises anxiety on our side, particularly when we get into this area of advanced conventional warfare, which we practice. Remember, we're in practice phase. We did it in Libya with our NATO allies. We've now said no options are off the table in Syria. What does that mean? And we said the same thing vis-a-vis Iran, talking about strikes to take out their nuclear capability. All of those things the Russians look at and say, we can't play in that ballpark conventionally. And so you're pushed back to the notion of link to what I like to call the little demons. You go back to Woland, remember the difference between Faustus and the Master and Margarita is, how is Faustus saved? The angels come down and he said, he's saved for striving after truth and knowledge. What is the agent of salvation? And Master and Margarita. Well, Woland has his little helpers. Begamuth, Bogdan, and they do their own thing. And if you agree with Karaganov and say, these things are under control, and this still decides, it is that evil which does good, we're in great shape. But if these little demons down here, in fact, lead to unanticipated consequences, we can look at a crisis unfolding where the mechanisms of control, which we have counted on in the Cold War era, will be inadequate to deal with the escalation of conflict. Global Zero is dead. My Obama administration does not talk about it. The Russians say good riddance. But we still have the modernization of conventional weapon systems. We still have people talking about effects with conventional systems that rival those of nuclear. We have the unconventional, what Marshal Agarkov called weapons based on new physical principles, which are coming into the equation, and we don't know how they play. And we have more players. In November, the Basic Trident Commission in England is now looking at what kind of deterrent should it build. Should it keep the Tridents, replace them, or do what? The Commission said, beyond the UK, what's happening in the rest of the world? And the conclusion it came to is, we are in the midst of a nuclear arms race. The United States is committed to spending $700 billion over the next decade for the modernization of our nuclear systems. The Russians are committed to spending $70 billion. Now, you can ask yourself, what do the Russians get for their $70 billion? If you know their defense industry, it may not be as much as that looks like. But the dynamic is, people are talking about either advanced conventional systems or nuclear ones being warfighters. Warfighters in environments where we are getting closer and closer to conflicts that evolve out of initial decisions without much notion of how we control and manage escalation. Remember Kosovo? Do you know how long the air campaign was supposed to go on in Kosovo as planned by NATO?
72 hours.
5 days. Vice President Gore told Yevgeny Primakov, who was then the foreign minister, fly back to Moscow. It'll be okay. This is all going to be over real fast. Was it over real fast? No, it went on for 79 days, and by the end of it, we were talking about escalating to ground combat. A negotiated settlement was done not by NATO. It was done by the EU. By Schroeder and Ansari, who were in fact saying, we're going to get this thing over so it doesn't escalate into something else. Libya. Libya started out, what was the purpose of the mission in Libya? What did the UN vote?
Defending citizens.
What did it end up being? What were the missions being flown by the end of it?
Close air support to ground troops.
Essentially supporting the opposing force in the field to bring about a political end.